Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and today we're going to tackle the issue of language existentialism. What is it and how is it useful for your everyday life using language? Let's get it. So language existentialism, condemned to be linguistically free. What is this all about? Of course, the term language existentialism comes from the philosophical current of existentialism, and this is not a monolithic theory. As you can see on the screen, there are a number of existentialist philosophies. The kind of existentialism we'll be tackling today is what is described here as popular existentialism. The idea that there is no universal meaning of life, and so existence precedes essence. And in particular, we'll talk about the theories of JeanPaul Sartre, the French philosopher. So you can see on the screen, JeanPaul Sartre was drafted for World War II, then taken as prisoner a year later and released the year after. Following the war, Sartre took a particular interest in freedom and social responsibility. And his main works are Being and Nothingness, and Existentialism is a Humanism, where he produced much of his theory on existentialism. Long story short, the key principles of JeanPaul Sartre's existentialism are that first, existence precedes essence. What does that mean? We don't have a fixed essence as human beings from birth. What we are is not predetermined. We have to construct that throughout our whole lives. That is why our existence, the fact that we are alive, precedes what we are. Second, life does not have any intrinsic meaning. The meaning of life is only the meaning that we are able to give it. There is nothing inherently meaningful in life. Number three, there are no absolutes to abide by. There are no absolute truths, absolute moral values, or final rules that we need to follow. And finally, we are condemned to be free, which means that because we have the choice of constructing the rules and the moral values and the truths we believe in, we also have the responsibility of doing that. So we are condemned, because we have the responsibility to be free, to choose. So we have as much freedom as responsibility. We are condemned to be free. In the words of Sartre himself, I can always choose, but I ought to know that if I do not choose, I am still choosing. According to Sartre, everything is a choice. Even when we choose not to act, we're still acting by omission. Hence the idea that we are condemned to be free, because even if we don't want to have to choose, we're still choosing at the end of the day. So we cannot choose not to choose. So the idea is that human beings are condemned to be free because once thrown into the world, they are responsible for everything they do. And this leads to a number of concepts, the first of which is anguish. Anguish is the emotional burden that is placed on people when they realize about their own freedom and choice. In other words, it is really overwhelming the fact that we need to choose every step of our lives, everything we believe in, every moral value we adopt. Therefore, we experience anguish. We experience a claustrophobic sensation. In addition to this, we have bad faith. From an existentialist perspective, when we say we're doing something in bad faith, it means that people believe they don't have a choice, and therefore they surrender their ability and moral obligation to choose to somebody else. They delegate that capacity and that moral obligation to choose at every step of the way, and they say, okay, I'm going to adopt the moral values of my parents, or I'm going to believe in the truths that my church or my teacher believes. That is an act of bad faith, of delegating your obligation and your ability to choose and living by the rules and decisions of other people. The opposite of bad faith is living authentically, meaning accepting, taking full charge of the full weight of your freedom, assuming that you have as much freedom as responsibility and that you are responsible for every single thing you do. So now that we know the tenets of JeanPaul Sartre's strand of existentialism, the question becomes, how does this apply to language? And I believe that this applies to language in the following sense. Number one, there are no native speakers. Since existence precedes essence, it follows that we're not born speaking any given language. Rather, the opposite is true. We're born and then we speak a certain language in a certain fashion, given some certain education in the specific contexts. From this, it follows number two. What language we use is the product of our own decision. We can always choose what language to speak and how we speak that particular language. We should not delegate in bad faith that decision to our teachers, our family, our friends. Ultimately, it is our own decision which language to speak and how to speak that. Number three, language rules are the product of contingent decisions. Because there are no absolute truths, because there are not absolute moral values, there are no final rules or guidelines, it follows that every rule is contingent, and every rule, be it the moral rule or the linguistic rule, is the product of a decision made by somebody. Therefore, we can always change that rule. Because language is a social cultural construct and it serves society, the minute it does no longer serve society, it can and ought to be changed. And finally, number four, how do we use language is the product of our own decision. Again, not only what language we speak, but also how do we use language, because rules are only possibilities that we choose to or not to follow, as opposed to pre-existing absolute truths we need to believe in. At the end of the day, everything we are and everything we do must be the product of our own decision. That is our ability, and that is our condemnation. So how do these principles translate into our everyday life? Let's take, for instance, the case of inclusive language, the kind of language we can engineer so that we avoid offending other people and we are as egalitarian as possible. We include as many people as possible, including groups that have been traditionally considered as minorities, be it racial, sexual, etc. So from a language existentialist perspective, when it comes to naming, we need to realize that our names and pronouns are the product of our decisions. I have both the choice and the responsibility of stating what my name is and what my preferred pronouns are. No one can do this in my stead. No one can do this on my behalf. Even if they try to say it on my behalf, it is ultimately up to me. How do I choose to be named and what is my pronoun? We all receive names when we are born, but whether we keep those names or not is the product of our own decision. I can go to a place and legally change my name into a different one if I choose to do so. And even if I don't decide to do so, I'm still choosing something, i.e., not to change my name. And so are those of other people. So it is also ultimately our decision to use the preferred names and pronouns that all the people want us to use to address them, even if they're supplicating or trying to force us into using the names and pronouns that they want us to use. Ultimately, we are both free and obligated to choose whether we agree or not with those requests. Second, grammar. From the perspective of language existentialism, grammar is never autonomous. Instead, it is a socio-cultural construct that we can decide to change. So when we have a language that has certain grammatical aspects that are not inclusive enough, if we choose not to follow those rules, we are allowed and entitled to do so because we have both the ability and the obligation to choose to follow or not to follow them. And finally, from the perspective of language existentialism, we can choose to be for or against inclusive language. But I think what's most important is the fact that at any rate, we realize that we need to choose, and we're going to choose whether we like it or not, because even not choosing to position yourself in this debate, it's choosing something, i.e. not to take a side on this debate. So our choice should be determined by the values we choose. For instance, if I embrace egalitarianism, the belief that we're all equal, then I should adopt inclusive language. Why? Because inclusive language is the linguistic expression that best aligns with my political values, in this case, egalitarianism. If I am misogynistic, then I should not choose to use inclusive language. Why? Because inclusive language is egalitarian and therefore is at odds with misogynistic beliefs. And really what language existentialism is asking us to do is not to be for or against inclusive language, is to choose for ourselves if we want to be in favor or against inclusive language. Because say, for instance, that somebody uses inclusive language because her teacher, her parents, or the church told that person to do it. In that case, even if that person is using inclusive language, this will be considered an act of bad faith, because that person is refusing, whether implicitly or explicitly, to take ownership for her own responsibility to choose her own values and the linguistic expression that best aligns with those values. Instead, is delegating that choice and saying, I'm going to use inclusive language because I was told to, because this rule cannot be changed, because there are too many people who agree with this practice, so I'm just going to follow them. That is relinquishing your moral ability and obligation to choose. That is choosing not to choose your own values. So is this a negative picture of human beings and their linguistic expression, or is this an encouraging perspective? Well, it is actually both. On the one hand, we have the full weight of responsibility. We cannot pretend that we are not making choices at every step of the way. We are, even when we choose not to make them, we're choosing something, i.e. not to make them. But at the same time, we are free to create our values from scratch, and the only people allowed to be the ultimate judge on whether those values should be embraced are ourselves. I hope you enjoyed this video. Share it with somebody who needs to learn about language existentialism today. And as always, thanks for watching.